Things in the southern region of Ukraine are about to go from bad to worse. Vladimir Putin has just declared martial law in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. This likely is a desperate attempt to maintain control in the regions, but also has a much darker and sinister purpose. What is happening in these Ukrainian states is reminiscent of Nazi Germany, as Putin is literally trying to change the ethnic makeup of the region. Let's examine what martial law is, why Putin has implemented it in illegally annexed parts of Ukraine, and what it could mean for the future. However, before we dive in, imagine this haunting scenario. Overnight, your freedom is completely revoked. You can't leave your house without permission, and you have to support an enemy in their war efforts. Every day is a worse nightmare than the last. You step outside of your house. The streets are desolate as the sun begins to set over the distant hills. With everything that's been going on, you forgot to buy bread this morning, and without it, your family will starve. You look down the street to make sure no one's there and run down an alleyway. On the other side of the street is your local bakery. You dart out onto the main road where you hear a voice scream, "Halt!" You freeze, knowing that if you take another step, you could be shot. 3 Russian soldiers walk up to you, rifles slung across their shoulders. "What are you doing out after curfew?" One of the soldiers asks. You explain that you forgot to buy bread and your family is starving. The soldier just laughs. They have no sympathy. "Well, if you're headed to the bakery, you must have money on you. And all money should be going to pay the soldiers who are fighting for your freedom, like us." You stare at the soldier with pleading eyes. You ask them to show mercy, as you have 2 little kids and a wife at home. They just continue to laugh. One of the soldiers grabs your arms and holds them behind your back. Another searches your pockets and finds your wallet. They take the money out of it, throw the wallet to the ground, and just for good measure, punch you in the stomach. "Now go back home and don't let us find you out after curfew again," the Russian soldier says before spitting on you. The soldiers walk away laughing. This is what your country has turned into since Russia invaded. And now that martial law is in place, the military can do anything they want. This is the current reality in parts of southern Ukraine. But what exactly is martial law, and what does it allow Putin to do? If we think back to several months ago when the war had just started, the goals of Vladimir Putin were vague at best and the ravings of a lunatic at worst. Just to recap how we got to where we are today, Putin proclaimed he wanted to reestablish a former Russian empire. He spewed lies and propaganda, stating that southern Ukraine had been stolen from Russia and that the citizens living there wanted to be reincorporated back to the motherland. Some people living in Ukraine did want this, but the vast majority enjoyed the independence and freedom from the oppressive regime of Russia and the democratic nature of the government. This brings us to the real reasons why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Yes, he wanted to form a new Russian empire. However, it was the democratic nature of Ukraine and the country becoming more westernized that actually led Putin to invade. He knew that if Ukraine became part of the European Union, NATO, or allied itself with the West, it could threaten his rule in Russia. Paranoia is a common trait among ruthless dictators because if citizens realized that their lives could be better if they had a say in the government and then decided to start a revolution, dictators tend to lose their lives. Putin probably always has this thought in the back of his mind, and as Ukraine became more and more westernized, Putin felt that he had to attack to save himself. It's not entirely clear which former Russian empire Putin wants to reestablish, however. When the former Soviet Union collapsed, Russia lost a lot of territory in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. However, if Putin is hoping to reform the Tsarist Empire of 1914, then there would be a lot more conflict in the future. It's important to remember that the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions were illegally annexed by Russia. In September, a staged referendum was conducted where voters were met at the polls by armed Russian soldiers who held them at gunpoint until they voted for their states to be annexed by Russia. That's right, the Ukrainian people living in the annexed regions of Ukraine were given a choice to vote for their homeland to be incorporated into Russia or die. There's little doubt that many Ukrainians were killed during the referendum for refusing to vote for annexation. The United Nations and the majority of the world do not recognize Russia's authority in these regions. However, this doesn't matter to Putin. Russia has occupied southern Ukraine for several months now, so the question becomes, why did Putin declare martial law now? Like many of Vlad's decisions, this one doesn't seem to be completely thought out. Martial law expands the power of the military and law enforcement agents in the region. Occupied Ukraine really didn't have much freedom to begin with. All Putin is doing by declaring martial law is giving a different name to what's already been happening. Under the umbrella of martial law, the military can impose curfews, restrict freedoms, take civilian property, enlist people into the army, and force residents to rebuild any destroyed infrastructure. Again, these things are already happening in the occupied territories. However, since Moscow hasn't declared martial law since the Soviet Union, this may be Putin's first official move to bring annexed parts of Ukraine into his Russian empire. But again, the question is, why now? What does Putin get out of declaring martial law? Putin has not just initiated martial law in Ukraine, but in the rest of Russia as well. However, there are different tiers of martial law depending on where you live. In Russia, Putin has called for basic martial law, which means nothing is really going to change, but citizens should be prepared to aid the military in its war effort by working in factories or enlisting in the army if asked. In southern Ukraine, the martial law is instated and labeled as maximum readiness, which means that the people in those regions will be asked to make sacrifices immediately to help Russia fight against the rest of Ukraine. Putin has continually said that the reason he needed to implement martial law is that Ukraine's government and its Western allies refused to accept the result of the annexation referendum as legitimate, which of course they weren't. Putin declared in one speech, "As is well known, the regime in Kyiv has refused to recognize the will of the people. We are trying to resolve difficult, large-scale challenges on providing security to Russia and protecting the future of Russia, defending our people." What it really comes down to is that Russia has suffered a number of significant defeats in the war against Ukraine. Most recently, this has happened in the battle to control Lyman, where Ukrainian forces humiliated the Russian military by holding their ground and forcing the Russian army into full retreat. It's also important to note that Ukraine still controls parts of Donbass, where Putin has declared martial law, which means that the citizens living under Russian military control will be asked to not only support Russia, but fight alongside them as well. Putin needed to declare martial law so that the military had the authority to use citizens as resources of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia however they deemed fit to defeat Ukrainian forces. Many Ukrainians have fled the Russian-occupied regions in the south. However, not everyone was so lucky. Martial law will give the Russian military the authority to compel any civilian under their control to aid the Russian war effort, which is a breach of the Geneva Convention. But Vladimir Putin has no concern over the proper conduct of war or basic human rights, so he's more than happy to formally increase his military's authority in southern Ukraine to allow them to use Ukrainian citizens however they see fit. The crazy thing is that by instituting martial law, Putin may be trying to mobilize a Ukrainian-style territorial defense force made up of Russian officers and part-time reservists, which would be supplemented by civilians. The martial law also allows the military to have greater control over who comes in and out of each region. There's currently a 7-day ban on civilians entering any of the annexed regions. However, since Russia doesn't control all of the territory in the 4 regions, this ban on movement will be extremely hard to enforce. The martial law declared by Putin also has a propaganda component to it. By stating he has the authority to modify the way things are being run in southern Ukraine, he is reinforcing the false fact that there were elections in the region and that the people living in the region are now happily a part of Russia. The decisions that Putin is making are all part of the narrative that he's just trying to do what's best for the Russian people. However, the rest of the world isn't falling for it, and it seems that Russian citizens might be losing faith in old Vladi and his regime. The implementation of martial law will likely be used to secure more resources for Russia. One main aspect of martial law is that the military can now repurpose any business or manufacturing center that they need. For example, metalworking factories that once produced materials for infrastructure can be repurposed into building weapons and war vehicles. Companies that procure natural resources such as fossil fuels or minerals can be forced to give their supply directly to the military. Basically, martial law allows the Russian government to convert any and all parts of its economy into a war machine. However, the most atrocious part of the martial law implemented by Putin is it will allow for easier deportation of certain populations out of Ukraine and into Russia. This is where things get a little too close to how Nazi Germany acted in World War II. It's no secret that Putin wants to enact mass deportation of certain Ukrainian populations to parts of Russia. The reason he wants to do this is to change the ethnic majority in the region. In Putin's eyes, Ukraine and much of Eastern Europe should still be part of the Russian Empire. By deporting problematic people who claim to have a culture separate from Russia's, Putin can create a more homogeneous state that's made up of people who are loyal to him. Putin's regime has claimed they're only using force to temporarily resettle people. However, the fact that certain people are being targeted for deportation strongly suggests there is a much more sinister agenda at work. Experts estimate that somewhere between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians have been deported from their homeland into Russia. It's not entirely clear where these people are being sent or what they're being forced to do, but there's a chance they're being put in camps where they're required to aid the Russian military by working in factories or dangerous mining operations. Obviously, this looks really bad for Putin and his regime, so they released a statement shortly before announcing that martial law would be coming, saying that the residents were free to evacuate from southern Ukraine and the government would not only help them relocate in any part of Russia, but would provide housing vouchers as well. This was a thinly veiled distraction from what was about to happen. Every free-thinking individual knew it was just more propaganda to make Putin look sympathetic, as his military forced people onto transports and sent them deep into Russia. Martial law also allows Putin to send more troops to annexed regions of Ukraine without admitting he is losing the war. The Russian people are becoming more and more disheartened. Those who believe in the cause are starting to wane. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country to make sure they're not conscripted into the military. Putin is losing the support of his own people. However, by declaring martial law, he can ensure that the military keeps Russian citizens in line while also giving him a reason to send more troops to Ukraine. For propaganda purposes, Putin says that martial law will help ensure the ideals of Russia are being upheld in the annexed regions. But the more likely reason why Putin needs more troops in Ukraine is he's afraid he'll lose the war. This also answers the question of why now. Russian forces have been defeated and pushed back several times in recent months. A war that was only supposed to last a month or two is quickly approaching a year. Putin will never admit it, but in the back of his mind, he is likely scared. If Russia loses the war in Ukraine, or if the war gets drawn out for much longer, the people of Russia will see Vladimir Putin as being weak. There's a good chance if this happens, he'll be overthrown and executed by his own citizens. Therefore, Putin must maintain as much control and influence as possible. He's doing this by using his military and giving them more power through martial law. This will force businesses and defense contractors to align with his goals and provide him with the soldiers and resources necessary to continue fighting in Ukraine. It'll also allow Putin to not only control the populations in the annexed regions more easily, but will also allow him to control his citizens at home, especially if they start to become unruly or try to start a revolution against him. Putin and the rest of his regime believe that enacting martial law across Russia and southern Ukraine is a show of strength. However, many think it indicates how desperate they've become. The fact that Vladimir Putin needs to position his military in a way that ensures his citizens will continue to support him in his war effort is a telling sign that things are going very badly for him. The desperate tactics are less strategic and more of an indication that Putin and his allies are losing control. The sad part is that martial law will likely cause more death and despair in occupied Ukraine. As Putin becomes more desperate, he'll continue to escalate his tactics to ensure he remains in power and the war can continue on. However, if Putin ever loses control or Russia is defeated, it will not only be the end of Putin's reign, but likely his life as well. Now watch why Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a failure, or check out how war in Ukraine will cause Russia to collapse.